Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are talking about the readings for this week. We have some really great readings, and just as a reminder, you can pick one or the other. You don't have to do both. And I'm going to talk about the readings first, and then I'll get into our instructive text for this week, the samples that feature some techniques regarding characterization. So our first story is Charles, written by Shirley Jackson, and you probably have read Shirley Jackson before because she is the author of The Lottery, and that's a pretty classic short story for high schools and colleges, and if you've gotten this far without reading it, I highly recommend you find it somewhere. But Charles is an interesting story. It's told from the point of view of a mother talking about her son Lori, who has just started kindergarten, and this friend or possibly frenemy he makes, Charles. Now, the reason that I picked it is because if you remember from the lecture on characterization, I talked about different things that comprise characterization. So what do we have? We have how people look, how they act, what they say, what they do, what they think, but we also have what others say or think about them. And so what we're getting here is some interesting characterization of a character, Charles, who the story is named after, who isn't on the page. So we just see what Lori says about him, what the teachers say about him, how the mother feels about him, but we never actually see Charles himself. And so it's quite interesting how this character is developed and how Lori thinks of him one way, his mother thinks of him in a quite different way. And I think that it's such an interesting character study because Lori, who's describing Charles, is a kindergartner, right? So he's not as reliable a witness as possibly an adult would be, because you're getting it from this child's point of view, and then his mother is kind of making assumptions based on what her son is telling her. So we have this boy in his class, and we see him over time. We have hints as to what this child is like, how Lori reacts to him, how others react to him, how Lori's parents react to him, and really how their son is being affected by this little boy, and his behavior is starting to change in kind of subtle ways. So we have kind of an unreliable narrator, because she's never actually met this kid. And I think that that's interesting too. The characterization we get of her as she's telling this story, you can really get a sense of who this woman is, what she's like. And even though this was originally written in 1949, I think that you could say that it was written this year and you'd be like, oh, okay, that checks out. It really holds up because it really is kind of the story of just a parent going through having their kid have this kind of troublesome friend. So the subtle characterization of the unnamed narrator is something I'd like you to look at. What is she like? How does she change from beginning to end? And what twists and turns do we find along the way in terms of her son as well as Charles, and how they change because they're in kindergarten, and that's a year a lot of kids change as they go to school. So it's quite an interesting study for that reason. Now, Flowers for Algernon is a little bit longer. If you don't have time if you don't have time this week, read Charles. If you have time for both, do both, because they're both wonderful stories. Flowers for Algernon I chose because we have if you watched Kurt Vonnegut's lecture before, that I gave you as optional viewing, he talked about having a character that starts in a lower place, they're brought up, and then maybe they come back to the place where they started. And this story is a character arc where we see that happening. So Charlie is a man with a mental disability. He is writing progress reports, so it's completely from his point of view. The spelling and the grammar start off where he's at. He's just learned how to read, even though he is in his 30s. He's doing these progress reports. He eventually has an operation that increases his intelligence, and then he comes kind of full circle. So in terms of characterization, there's a lot here. There are psychological changes and emotional changes. There are social changes that Charlie goes through as he kind of catches up to some of people who would be his peers. There are changes in language to show the characterization, so the deliberate misspellings, and then the growing vocabulary. We have obviously intellectual changes, and you can really see the roundness of this character. The short story was eventually turned into a novel, and the novel is wonderful also. But even in this short story, you really get a sense of who Charlie is and what his life is like and why he wants to become more intellectual, and how he struggles with that once it is awarded to him. So he starts to remember things differently. He starts to describe interactions with people that he thinks of as his best friends who are really not, and all of that kind of thing. So it's a really intricate characterization for a story of just 20 pages. And the structure of the story is there again in terms of plot, seeing the rise and then the fall of this character. Also, it's done. This is called an epistolary story. Eventually, it's an epistolary novel. So epistolary means that it's told through documents, and we have some epistolary stories are done with letters, which the word comes from epistle. Some are done through letters, some are done through diaries. Sometimes one of the books I wrote was done through like police transcripts and some diaries and some emails and things like that. So it's an epistolary book. So I'd like you to look at the point of view as well. We're going to talk about that later on in the class, but it's sort of in a sense unreliable, but at the same time, you can see how people are prejudiced against him. You can see how people are treating him poorly, and you can see who's treating him well. So again, you get that characterization, what he's saying, how he's seeing the world, how he's describing things, and a lot more about how he feels. So it's completely different from Charles, where the character in question is off the page and we just get what other people say and think about him. Here we have a really intimate look at this character, and it really is an interesting character study. So for that reason, I chose it for you for this week. So let's talk about our mentor text, our creative writing sample. There are actually 2 excerpts this week. The first, 2 books that I took excerpts from. The first is from a book called First Case Scenario. It's a contemporary mystery. And one of the problems in the first draft of that book is that the author had a lot of characters that did not need to be there. And she eventually wrote book 2. I think she's working on book 3. But it's kind of interesting that she had a lot of character ideas, and eventually she was like, oh, this is going to be a series. I can put some of those characters in other books, right? But for this first book, what ended up happening is that we had some plot holes because there were too many characters. We had some underdevelopment of characters just because there wasn't really space to develop them. So they're kind of just a name and some attributes, and then they do something and then they're gone. So there's some lessons to be seen there. All characters should have a purpose. The way that they're described by the protagonist, who's also the narrator, because it's from the first person point of view. So at one point she was about 5 feet tall. She weighed about 150 pounds. That's just not how you would describe somebody you met. I might say, like, she's kind of petite, or she's a little bit shorter than me, or like me, she has some curves. I might say that, but I wouldn't it's the same as if you're describing a table. I might say it was a really long table. It took up the whole room. I wouldn't say the table was 7.5 feet long and 3 feet high. And, I wouldn't go into full on dimensions of a table. And you don't want to do that with your characters either. So I think that there's some lessons there. And I talk about why the scene was taken out. The second set of excerpts is from a book called Undercover Chefs. And this is a middle grade novel written for tweens, grades 4 to 6, 4 to 7, somewhere in that range. Because it's for kids, there is a character who is the antagonist, and she is a school administrator. In the first version, she was kind of cartoonish and a little bit over the top, especially for that age range. And I said to the author that, when you have an administrator doing some of the things she did, from the kids' point of view, they're evil, but from her point of view, she's trying to help this school. Now, she misappropriates some funds, so she's not really completely just trying to help the school. But that is part of her character. And so what she did was just very subtly change a few things, a few verbs here and there, a few descriptors of the character, a little bit of the dialogue, and she just kind of tweaked it and had this very subtle shift so that we still have a villain, but it's not like an over-the-top, that would have been really more appropriate for a book for second or third graders. So instead of shrieking, she asks a question. She looks suspicious instead of basically, she had her kind of throwing a tantrum. She at one point kind of shows some remorse, looks like she might cry. And I gave this to you guys because it really is a great example of how some small changes can help make your character rounder and less flat and less like an archetype or a trope that we've seen over and over, make them a little bit more real. So adding to that verisimilitude. I think that a lot of times when people want to change a character, they think about large-scale changes, kind of like the first one. You cut this scene or you cut that character out, you change their personality entirely, and that doesn't always have to be the case. So I hope that you can learn from it, and that way I think that there's a lot to learn from the mentor texts as well. And again, you only need to read one, you don't have to do both. So that's it. I can't wait to see your thoughts in the discussion forum, and I'm excited to see what you write this week, as always. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.